The well-known folk song Swannanoa Tunnel has been covered by numerous recording artists. It originated, however, as a work song, written and performed by the incarcerated laborers forced to construct the Western North Carolina Railroad and dig the 1,800 32-foot-long Swannanoa Tunnel. The version of the song that follows, sung by Will Love in 1935, is the earliest known recorded version of the song by a black person. As Jeff Keith and Kevin Kerberg note in their article Somebody Died Babe in the Bitter Southerner, Love's version, unlike other recorded versions, bears all the hallmarks of a classic Hammer song. He sings unaccompanied and pounds on something nearby to mimic the hammer blows of hard labor.
Last December, I remember when those cold days, when you hear my what's the hell? Somebody down, babe, somebody down. When you hear that, somebody died, somebody dead. I got down to that's my home, that's my home. I'm a holy from my soul, all day long, all day long.
The Sunday, April 15, 1877 edition of the Charlotte Observer reported the following. A female convict on the Western North Carolina Railroad emptied a vial of sulfuric acid into the coffee of Mr. Griffin, the newly appointed steward, but he did not like the taste, so the poison did no damage. Attempting to kill or incapacitate Steward Griffin may have been a planned first step in what was to come just days, perhaps hours later at Round Knob Stockade, near present-day Old Fort, North Carolina. The stockade, consisting of a series of wooden bunkhouses, was one of several that were built along the steep mountain terrain between Old Fort and Ridgecrest to house more than 500 incarcerated laborers sent to the mountains from the state penitentiary to construct the railroad line into Asheville. At the time of the attempted poisoning, the Round Knob Stockade housed at least 150 prisoners, nearly 95% of whom were black men. Incarcerated women at the stockade, all of whom were black, were tasked with cooking and cleaning for both prisoners and guards, giving the unnamed poisoner ample opportunity to spike Griffin's coffee with sulfuric acid, which she had likely acquired from another prisoner who used the acid to manufacture nitroglycerin on site. When the poison was discovered, the woman confessed and was immediately placed under heavy guard. Still, unrest at Round Knob Stockade continued to brew, and for good reason. Life at the stockade was brutal. Incarcerated men worked up to 7 days a week, 10 hours a day, using rocks, shovels, wagons, rail cars, pickaxes, and nitroglycerin to cut tunnels and lay track. Rations consisted of cornbread and beans, bacon and cabbage when available. The prisoners were chained together and forced to endure bitter winters and sweltering summers with little protection from the elements. When a prisoner died, he was most often unceremoniously buried beside the track, and another prisoner was sent from Raleigh to take his place, making the mountainside into a long, narrow graveyard. Using incarcerated laborers, however, had not been the state's original intention. Before the railroad was completed, travelers and supplies could only reach western North Carolina by scaling the mountains on foot, on horseback, or by wagon or stagecoach. This relative isolation became an emergency issue when a drought in the 1840s resulted in a total crop failure in the region. Soon after, the state of North Carolina earmarked funds to bring the railroad westward. Some of the work was completed by paid laborers, but railroad executives also lobbied then-Governor Zebulon Vance to approve the use of enslaved men from eastern North Carolina to make up for labor shortages that were delaying the completion of the railroad in the western part of the state. Slave owners began renting out the people they enslaved to the railroad for a profit. With the onslaught of the Civil War, the railroad project stalled at the foot of the mountains, and much of it was later destroyed by General Stoneman's troops on their march through the region. The project again faltered when the men in charge of construction embezzled the funds earmarked for the railroad and skipped town on a train with no lights and $4 million in looted railroad bonds. Though the state apprehended the criminals, they did not recover the funds, nor did the men, who were wealthy, white, and well-connected, serve any prison time. Now in desperate straits, the new Railroad Commission appointed former Confederate Major James W. Wilson as the new chief engineer on the project to bring the railroad up the mountain. With Wilson at the helm, the state found a new solution to their financial woes. Rather than pay workers, they sent a steady stream of men from the penitentiary in Raleigh and forced them to construct the railroad. It cost less than 80 cents per day to feed, clothe, guard, and house the incarcerated men and women, less than the daily wages for a paid worker. Though the 13th Amendment had outlawed slavery in the United States, there was a loophole. Involuntary servitude could continue if it was used as punishment for a crime, and when the state of North Carolina needed free labor, even petty crimes carried extremely harsh sentences. Young, strong men and boys, some as young as 14, were sentenced to work on the railroad for as little as stealing a newspaper. So-called pig laws made the theft of any farm animal worth $1 or more punishable by up to 5 years hard labor, and black codes imprisoned those accused of vagrancy or unemployment. More than 95% of those working on the road were black. Many were wrongfully convicted, and all but the very youngest black men and women had likely been born into slavery. Building the railroad was a feat of engineering that required the incarcerated laborers to construct nearly 8 miles of bridges, loops, and tunnels to traverse about 3 miles of terrain. The last hurdle to bring the railroad into western North Carolina was to cut a tunnel through the mountain at the top of the gap. At 1,832 feet in length, the Swannanoa Tunnel was the longest of the 7 tunnels that the men cut into the mountain and the deadliest to build. To speed the process along and win political favor, James Wilson, the engineer in charge of the project, who was also feeling pressure from Governor Vance, decided that the incarcerated men should begin digging at both sides of the mountain until they met in the middle. But before the work could begin on the western end of the tunnel, more than 300 men were tethered to a locomotive engine, the Salisbury, and forced to haul it up the steep grade on temporary tracks. The engine would be used to transport the men to work sites and help remove debris as the workers cut deeper into the mountain. As the engine inched up the mountain and armed guards watched, sometimes whipping the men like mules, the prisoners lifted the heavy steel track from behind the train and lugged it piece by piece to the front to create new track. Accidents plagued the digging of the tunnel. One man died when a powder keg fired without warning. Landslides buried workers where they stood. Men perished underneath train wheels, and it is believed that the same day the men working at the eastern and western ends of the tunnel finally broke through the mountain and James Wilson declared that daylight entered Buncombe County, 20 men died in a cave-in of the tunnel. Despite being chained, watched by armed guards, and weakened by the harsh climate, brutal working conditions, communicable illnesses, and lack of food and sleep, the incarcerated laborers resisted their imprisonment. The Asheville Citizen reported that on April 8, 1877, shortly after the failed poisoning attempt, 150 prisoners at Round Knob Stockade ran as a group into the night. The woods surrounding the stockade were dense, and it seemed likely that some of the prisoners would find freedom. But, according to the Citizen report, no prisoners escaped. 9 were killed by armed guards, 14 were wounded. Days later, the Citizen and the numerous papers across the state that had rerun the story printed retractions. To assuage fears about the use of quote-unquote convict labor, James Wilson denied the escape story as a hoax. No one had been killed, Wilson said, and there had been no escape attempt. Still, in its biannual report, the penitentiary noted that 42 incarcerated individuals had escaped from the Western North Carolina Railroad between November 1st, 1876 and November 1st, 1877. 34 had died. By the time the first passenger train carrying a who's who of wealthy North Carolinians, including Governor Vance, traveled to Asheville from Old Fort in late 1879, nearly 150 prisoners had escaped, and more than 150 had died on the tracks of disease, exposure, accidents, and escape attempts. Both these numbers would more than double over the next 4 years as work continued. One reporter remarked, writing of this first passenger trip up the steep grade, "Arriving at the eastern approach of the Swannanoa Tunnel, we found 3 or 4 engines on hand, apparently to act as our escort. Here, another halt was made in order to allow the governor and his board of internal improvements to visit the prisoners' stockade, examine into their quarters, their mode of treatment, etc. And here we also cut loose from the refreshment car, which had been attached to our car, and all being declared in readiness, lights being placed in and ahead of our car, we plunged into the bowels of the Blue Ridge, and now we can only see the dim outlines of our fellow passenger by the flickering light, hear the water trickling down from the top and sides of the tunnel, see the black jutting rocks at our elbow, forming almost every conceivable shape as we pass them, and we at last realize that we are hundreds of feet under the earth, passing through this little channel which human art, energy, and industry has made through nature's mighty barrier. We feel that the governor of the great state of North Carolina is now formally uniting the 2 sections of the state, that the East and the West are literally shaking hands, and that hereafter we should, in its every sense, be one people with one common interest, and God grant it may be so. And thus we pass through the mountain a distance of nearly 1,900 feet when we hear the cry, "A light ahead!" And once more we are coming to daylight, and as the engine emerges into the state of Buncombe, 3 rousing and hearty cheers go up for Major Wilson, for Western Carolina, and for the governor of the state. The deed is done, and the tunnel is now opened to the trade and traffic of the world. As the celebration continued, the families of the men and women on the road mourned the deaths of their sons, husbands, brothers, sisters, daughters, and friends. In 2020, a small group of volunteers from Buncombe and McDowell counties, under the direction of Dr. Dan Pierce and Mayor Steve Little, founded the Rail Memorial Project to recognize the unwilling sacrifice of the more than 3,000 incarcerated laborers who were brought to our region to work on the Western North Carolina Railroad. Just over a year later, in October 2021, and thanks to the generosity of donors from across the state, the group erected a memorial at Andrews Geyser in Old Fort, near the site of the Round Knob Stockade. In 2022, the group is working to identify and memorialize potential grave sites on the mountain with the use of ground-penetrating radar and human remains detection dogs, and also to erect informational panels about the people who constructed the railroad. The Western North Carolina Historical Association's Outstanding Achievement Award Committee commends the volunteers who worked together to make this project a reality, including Dr. Dan Pierce, Mayor Steve Little, Melvin Lytle, Eric Boyce, Ray McKesson, Roanne Bishop, Ashley McGee-Whittle, Dr. Darren Waters, Jim Stokely, Jeff Futch, Ann Chesky Smith, Kat Warren, and Stephanie Swepson Twitty, as well as Jimmy Logan and Paul Twitty for constructing the monument, Blair Tormey and Paul Martin for their assistance locating potential grave sites, and Drs. Jeff Keith and Kevin Kerberg for their ongoing research into the work song, Swannanoa Tunnel, which has aided in the efforts to publicly recognize this previously hidden history. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, we join the Rail Memorial Project in recognizing the people whose unwilling sacrifice brought the railroad into Western North Carolina. The monument lists the names of 181 men and women whose names were noted on the 1880 McDowell County U.S. Census, and a few additional people who the local papers noted as being sentenced to work on the road. Since the monument was erected, an additional 107 names have been uncovered in the Buncombe County Census of 1880. All 288 names are listed here. Please join us in a moment of silence to honor the memory of these men and women and the thousands of others whose names are still hidden.